Today, a new old era of the RBA. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, well, that is posts covering finance and property news. Well, the Treasurer Jim Chalmers announced on Friday the appointment of Michele Bullock as Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia for a 7-year term commencing on the 18th of September. Actually, thankfully, Dr. Chalmers has realised the potential cost to the credibility of Australian economic management from imposing a Canberra econocrat to run the nation's central bank, so we should be thankful at least for that. In the media statement, Governor Phil Lowe said the Treasurer has made a first-rate appointment. I congratulate Michele on being appointed Governor. The Reserve Bank is in very good hands as it deals with the current inflation challenge and implementing the recommendations of the review of the RBA. I wish Michele all the best. The role of Reserve Bank Governor comes with several responsibilities, including Chair of the Reserve Bank Board, the Payments System Board, and Council of Financial Regulators. As Governor, Ms. Bullock will also be responsible for the management of the bank under the Reserve Bank Act of 1959. Following the Treasurer's announcement, Deputy Governor Michele Bullock said, "I'm deeply honoured to have been appointed to this important position. It is a challenging time to be coming to this role, but I will be supported by a strong executive team and boards, and I'm committed to ensuring that the Reserve Bank delivers on its policy and operational objectives for the benefit of the Australian people." Governor Lowe will continue his position until the end of his term on the 17th of September, so that means we'll get another couple of rate decisions out of him. And the position of Deputy Governor from the 18th of September will be filled by the Treasurer in due course. Now, Phil Lowe, I think, is carrying the can for the Albanese government's broken wage promises. The RBA's first female governor is a capable, experienced and down-to-earth replacement, and Albanese and Chalmers needed a fall guy after breaking their foolish promise to lift the wages and living standards of ordinary Australians without any plan to do so. Australia's outgoing central bank chief Philip Lowe proved to be a convenient scapegoat for public anger over surging living costs and rising interest rates, meaning that Friday's decision to jettison him was really of no surprise. Lowe's 7-year term has been punctuated by extreme turbulence ranging from global disinflation to a worldwide pandemic and the biggest European conflict since World War II, which will have made operating monetary policy even more challenging than usual. But of course, below the waterline, we have neoliberalism driving the philosophy, a set of models that are disconnected from reality, and of course, a very strong link with Treasury, so the independence of the RBA is still, in my mind, a question. Now, the Governor did draw on all his experience to try and make judgment calls to cope with the circumstances, and frankly, they didn't really come off. Initially, he held rates higher than economic circumstances would have dictated. That's before the pandemic. And then when COVID-19 hit, he took the unprecedented step of telling Australians that there was unlikely to be a rate rise before 2024, when he didn't need to say that. His aim, both times, was to do what he thought was best for the economy, with the latter guidance to provide confidence during a worldwide health crisis. But Lowe, like other central bankers, was caught out by the breakout of inflation and had to tighten fast. And as a result, the first rate hike came in May 2022. And people who took the respected RBA chief at his word were, in fact, quite angry. While most central bankers endure a backlash in tightening cycles, the aggression toward Lowe was unprecedented in Australia. Sky News and Sydney's Daily Telegraph newspapers particularly described him as a dead man walking, and a TV camera crew was permanently camped outside the governor's house. So I'm afraid the mainstream media in Australia generally have not given things a fair show. Phil Lowe's position has been untenable for the past 6 to 12 months, said Callum Pickering, chief economist at global job site Indeed. But his treatment over the past year, the unwarranted abuse for doing his job, was quite frankly disgusting. Even before the pandemic, Lowe was grappling with disinflation, yet he refused to cut rates for an extended period to avoid a housing bubble. It was a judgment call, and he maintained the cost of borrowing wasn't the problem, and the economy needed more fiscal spending and business investment. In the end, as the economy stagnated, he resumed cutting after a 3-year hiatus. The Reserve Bank needs help in prosecuting its management of economic cycles and help from fiscal policy makers, and that hasn't really been forthcoming over Governor Lowe's term of office, said Alex Joyner, chief economist at IFM Markets. In fact, later in the pandemic, Lowe slashed rates to 0.1% and began unconventional monetary policy, of course, aping other central bankers in other countries. But international experience has now shown that this exposes central banks to political pressure and problems, and yet, determined to do all he could to support the economy, the RBA undertook quantitative easing and ran a yield target policy along with his 2024 rate rise guidance, and of course also launched the term funding facility, very, very cheap money to the banks, which of course they are now having to pay off. That's going to put pressure on the banks down the track. Combined with the vast fiscal stimulus, the strategy proved successful though, and Australia did become the first developed world nation to regain the lost economic output as unemployment fell to the lowest level in half a century. But Lowe allowed stimulus to drag on way too long. The RBA began its tightening cycle in May 2022. That's later than the Federal Reserve and New Zealand, and has moved more cautiously than many of its counterparts. Australia's 4 percentage point hikes compare with the Fed's 5 points and the Reserve Bank of New Zealand's 5.25 points. The slow path reflected Lowe's desire to preserve pandemic-era job gains and to engineer a soft landing in the economy. A very narrow path, as he kept saying. Anyone who knows what the Reserve Bank is supposed to do and what its charter says to do couldn't really criticise Phil Lowe, said Bernie Fraser, the RBA Governor from 1989 to 1996. The 2024 forward guidance had some unfortunate consequences, much as you might want to respond to appeals for more information about what the bank's going to do in the future. You just can't do that when there's so many fundamental uncertainties out there, he said. Lowe actually apologised to Australians for the guidance during parliamentary testimony earlier this year, saying he was sorry if people listened to what we've said and then acted on that. Anyway, now Michele Bullock will take the reins. It's a quality appointment. Bill Evans, the outgoing chief economist at Westpac, said, "We're in store for someone who's courageous, someone who'll be very well trained and going to provide the stability that's needed to move the Reserve Bank to its next stage." Phil Lowe, of course, made similar mistakes to most other central bank governors and has taken similar steps to rectify Australia's worst inflation outbreak in a generation. That turned the erstwhile honourable public servant into the fall guy for the political costs of normalising the economy's ultra-low interest rates following the excess policy stimulus and broken supply lines of the pandemic. And of course, all that liquidity flooding into the market created inflation in the first place. Central banks still don't want to admit this. So Chalmers' choice of the experienced, capable and down-to-earth Deputy Governor Michele Bullock is the best next option to continue the thankless task of making Australia a low-inflation economy once more and to sensibly bed down the structural changes to the Reserve Bank recommended by the independent review, including fewer interest rate meetings and regular press conferences, while also tackling uncomfortably high inflation. Bullock said on Friday, after she was announced as the 9th Reserve Bank Governor, that a big part of her role will be leading the bank through the change. Treasury Jim Chalmers described this as a history-making appointment and the best person to take the bank into the future. In fact, Bullock, who hails from country New South Wales, will become the RBA's first female governor Having worked in various positions in the central bank over the past 38 years, she took on the role of Deputy Governor in April last year and has been part of the 9-member rate-setting board through the current tightening cycle, which began a month after her promotion. While the policy implications of her appointment are unclear, some economists describe her as slightly more dovish than incumbent Phil Lowe. Still, the announcement didn't prompt economists to adjust their forecast terminal rate from 4.1% now, and, well, frankly, market reaction was pretty muted. The RBA does not provide a public record of voting for policy decisions, so it's unknown if the board is unanimous or split, given no individual votes, said George Thano, chief economist for Australia at UBS Group. More broadly, the relative position of Bullock is difficult to discern. At the margin, some say that Bullock is on the dovish side, referring to a recent speech in which she strongly stressed that full employment had always been one of the RBA's two main objectives. And Diana Maucinia, the deputy chief economist at AMP, also endorsed that view. From some of her speeches over the past year, I've taken out that she's probably a little bit more concerned than Philip Lowe was around the lags involved with monetary policy. I also get the sense that she's a little bit more attuned to the risks to the household sector, especially in Australia, where households are much more sensitive to interest rate changes compared to a lot of other countries. Under Bullock, there will be a slight tweak to the RBA's inflation mandate. The government is set to sign a new statement on the conduct of monetary policy by year's end and will specify the RBA's 2 to 3% inflation target should be aimed at the midpoint and achieved, quote, within a reasonable time frame. That compares with the current aim of staying inside it on average over time. That change is part of a suite of recommendations from the independent review of the RBA that is likely to be legislated next year. Lowe already announced the rate-setting board will shift to 8 meetings a year from 11 beginning 2024, and that there will be a press conference after each one. RBA watchers maintain that Bullock has the heft and gravitas to drive the implementation of the review, including creating a separate monetary policy board with 7 external members. She is well known and respected across the financial services industry, said Matt Common, Chief Executive Officer at CBA. She is considered, she has extensive experience, and is well suited to lead the RBA at this time. An RBA veteran, Bullock has held assistant governor roles overseeing the financial system, including the housing market risks, as well as business services and the currency, and she's highly regarded as a leader for her plain-spoken manner and down-to-earth demeanour. She does have a lot of expertise as an economist. One of the things I really value in this appointment is the style and nature of her leadership, Chalmers told reporters on Friday. She is an accomplished leader, a highly respected leader, and that's what we need in the bank to take it forward. But Michele Bullock faces a challenging initiation to the role as she moves to implement recommendations from a review of the Reserve Bank, according to Fraser. Fraser, who helmed the RBA from 1989 to 1996, warned it will be a difficult first 6 months for the new governor. The reason is that she will need to make a start on implementing 51 recommendations from a review of the RBA while bringing inflation under control and preserving the bank's independence. The recommendations including establishing a separate monetary policy committee, board members making regular appearances to discuss the economy and press conferences after each decision. Among others, the review is like a cluster bomb, said Fraser, who set the 2 to 3% inflation target and laid the ground for RBA independence, formalised by his successor. It's got lots of little bits and pieces in there that have already fallen out of the sky, and they're lying dormant, he said after Bullock was named the next governor, but they're potentially difficult for the bank and for the country. Some of the changes are going to require amendments to the bank's underlying legislation, that 1959 Reserve Bank Act, opening up the possibility of horse trading between political parties. Lowe, prior to review, had worried about the threat of unexpected changes arising from altering the Act. Chalmers has sought to avert those risks, though, by enlisting the support of the main opposition Liberal Party to avoid minor parties becoming involved. And Fraser said he was angered by some of the criticisms directed at Lowe by lawmakers, including Australian Greens, who hold the balance of power in the Senate. Some Green senators have demanded Lowe be dismissed and that Parliament use reserve powers to reverse interest rate increases. It's going to be a pretty challenging time for the Treasurer and for Michele, I think, to get through that in a way that doesn't impinge upon the independence of the bank, he said. You don't have independence without credibility, or credibility without independence. And one thing to note, in a recent speech about the labour market, Bullock seemed to suggest higher unemployment was perhaps a necessary trade-off required to get inflation under control. She said, some may hear this and think that the Reserve Bank is prioritising its inflation objective ahead of its full employment objective. Although it is true that we are resolute in returning inflation to target, this does not mean that unemployment has to take a back seat. There are two important points to make here, she said. The first is that the board has been willing to accept a somewhat more gradual return of inflation to target than many other central banks. A faster return to target would likely mean more job losses in the short term. Our judgment is that if we can return inflation to target in a reasonable time frame while preserving as many of the employment gains as we can, that would be a better outcome. And indeed, our most recent forecasts have inflation returning to target by mid-2025, while unemployment growth slows but does not contract. The unemployment rate is expected to rise to 4.5% by late 2024. While 4.5% is higher than the current rate, this outcome will still leave us below where it was pre-pandemic and not far off some estimates of what the NARU might currently be. In other words, the economy will be closer to a sustainable balance point. Of course, she said, those forecasts are subject to a considerable amount of uncertainty. We do not have a crystal ball. There will be developments in the future that none of us foresee. The second point is that we need to think about the consequences for the labour market of not getting inflation under control. Price stability is a prerequisite for a strong economy and full employment. Indeed, it is very difficult to sustain full employment without price stability. If high inflation were to become entrenched in people's expectations, it would be very costly to reduce later, involving even higher interest rates and a larger rise in unemployment. A deep and long-lasting recession would be likely, which would mean a substantial rise in the unemployment rate. And she concluded, our goal is to return the labour market and the market for goods and services back to a level more consistent with full employment, something like the endpoint in our forecasts. We think this can be achieved if employment and the economy more gradually grow at a below-trend pace for a while. This would help to bring demand and supply into better balance and give us the greater chance of securing sustainable full employment into the future. But if you stand back and think about all of this, I think there are 3 points. Firstly, this seems to me like the same old RBA and policy and strategy. No surprise, of course, because Bullock has been entrenched in that organisation for a long, long time and is one of the main proponents of all of those parameters that have been in place for quite some long time too. The second point is that inflation is going to be tough to get under control. So I think the markets are right in predicting high interest rates and the RBA right to suggest that inflation won't come back into target until the middle of 2025, so higher rates for longer. And thirdly, of course, and this is the big one, the RBA has been left somewhat isolated because politicians have not actually pulled the levers they should have been pulling around productivity and other reforms as well. In fact, over the last decade plus, politicians have stepped back and pushed the RBA forward, and the RBA only has one lever: interest rates. So I think the bottom line is this: Michele Bullock is a safe choice. We'll get somewhat similar and parallel strategies of what we've seen, different flavour perhaps in terms of the way that information is presented and a different culture perhaps, but ultimately no discontinuous activity. And that means that neoliberalism, the assumption around the way markets work, and the assumption that interest rates is the lever to pull is embedded and will continue. That unfortunately means households and businesses will be paying a lot more for a lot longer. And meanwhile, politicians can stand back and say, it's nothing to do with us, when in fact, the buck should stop with them. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.